The scream tore across the Wyoming plains like nothing Jack Mercer had ever heard. And when he crested that rise, what he saw stopped his heart cold. A 5-year-old girl standing in the merciless sun holding a broken branch over her dying mother's body. 2 days without water, covered in dried blood. And when Jack tried to help, she raised that branch like a weapon and said, "That's what they said, too. The men who came, they said they just wanted water." Jack Mercer had been alone for 8 years. 8 years of silence and ghosts, and visiting the graves of his wife and daughter. He had convinced himself he wanted nothing, needed no one. But this broken woman and her traumatized child were about to uncover a conspiracy that reaches all the way to Boston high society. A grandmother who doesn't want to save her granddaughter. She wants to control a fortune, and she's willing to kill anyone who stands in her way. What happens when a man who fears his own darkness must become the monster to protect the innocent? This story carries a truth that might change how you see your own struggles. Choosing to love again after loss isn't weakness. It's the bravest thing a broken person can do. If you've ever felt like hiding from the world was safer than risking your heart, Jack's journey will show you that second chances exist for those brave enough to take them. If you believe that broken people can build beautiful things together, if stories about redemption, courage, and finding family in unexpected places move your soul, then you're exactly where you belong. Hit subscribe, drop a comment about what second chances mean to you, and share this with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to start again. Now, let's begin. The scream tore across the Wyoming plains like nothing Jack Mercer had ever heard. Not the cry of a wounded animal, not the shriek of a hawk diving for prey. This was human. This was terror given voice. Jack reined his buckskin mare to a hard stop, squinting through waves of heat that made the horizon shimmer like water. He had been riding fence lines since dawn, checking for breaks where his cattle might wander. The August sun beat down with the kind of heat that could kill a man if he was not careful. Jack Mercer had always been careful. 38 years on this earth had taught him that survival meant knowing when to move and when to stay still. It meant keeping your head down, your mouth shut, and your heart locked up tight where nothing could touch it. But that scream. Lord Almighty, that scream. He urged his mare forward, one hand dropping to the rifle strapped to his saddle. Could be anything out here. Outlaws. Comanches, though they had been pushed further south in recent years. A wagon accident. A woman giving birth alone on the trail. When he crested the rise, what he saw stopped his heart cold. A covered wagon sat at a broken angle in a shallow ravine, one wheel shattered beyond repair. Supplies lay scattered across the hard-packed ground like someone had torn through them in a fury. A trunk with its lid ripped open, clothing trampled into the dirt, a water barrel on its side, dark stains spreading beneath it. But it was the two figures that made Jack dig his heels into his mare and ride hard down the slope. A child stood in the merciless sun, holding a broken cottonwood branch over a woman lying motionless on the ground. The little one could not have been more than 5 years old. Blonde hair hung in tangled knots around a face smudged with dirt and dried tears. Her calico dress, once maybe light blue, was now brown with dust and marked with rusty streaks that Jack recognized immediately. Blood. Dried blood. The child was trying to shade her mother from the sun, trying to keep death at bay with nothing but a stick and stubborn will. Jack dismounted before his mare fully stopped, boots hitting the ground with purpose. The child's head snapped toward him, and he saw terror flash across her small face. But she did not run. Instead, she widened her stance and raised that branch like a weapon, her thin arms trembling with the effort. "Stay back," the girl's voice cracked, barely above a whisper. "Do not touch her." Jack raised his hands slowly, palms out, showing he meant no harm. "Easy now. I am not here to hurt anyone." That is what they said. The child's blue eyes were red-rimmed but fierce as any cornered animal. The men who came, they said they just wanted water. Jack's jaw tightened. He had seen enough in his years to know exactly what that meant. Men who said they wanted water, but took everything else. "How long ago?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle. 2 days, maybe 3. The girl swayed slightly, and Jack realized she was fighting to stay upright. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her skin was red from sun exposure. "I cannot remember. It is so hot. Where is your father?" The branch dipped. "Dead. They shot him when he tried to stop them." The words came out flat, empty, delivered with the kind of shock Jack had heard from soldiers who had seen too much, too fast. No child should ever sound like that. No child should know that kind of loss. "What is your name?" he asked. "Emma." She licked her cracked lips. "Emma Wright. This is my mama, Sarah. I am Jack Mercer. I have got a ranch about 5 miles west of here." Jack took a careful step forward, then another, when Emma did not raise the branch higher. "Emma, your mama needs help. Real help. The kind I can give her if you let me." The girl studied him with an intensity that seemed far too old for her age. Jack could see her weighing his words, searching his face for lies. She had learned to look for lies. 5 years old, and already she knew that men could not be trusted. Finally, the branch lowered. "She will not wake up," Emma whispered. "I tried. I keep trying." Jack closed the distance between them and knelt beside Sarah Wright. The heat radiating from her skin told him what he needed to know before he even checked her pulse. Weak and rapid beneath his fingers. Her breathing was shallow and uneven. Her shoulder was wrapped in bloody strips of fabric that had already soaked through. Fever, infection, dehydration. Out here in the Wyoming Territory, any one of those could kill. All 3 together was a death sentence. "How long has she been like this?" Jack asked. "Since yesterday morning. She was talking before that. Told me to stay with her. Told me not to leave her." Fresh tears cut tracks through the dirt on Emma's cheeks. "I did not leave her. I stayed. You did good." Jack meant every word. "You kept her shaded. That might have saved her life." He stood and moved to his horse, pulling his canteen free. When he returned, he carefully lifted Sarah's head and wet her lips. Most of the water ran down her chin, but some made it into her mouth. She did not respond. "We need to move her," Jack said. "Get her somewhere cool, somewhere I can treat her proper." "Where?" "My ranch. It is not fancy, but it has walls and a roof and a well with cold water." Emma looked at her mother, then back at Jack. He could see the war playing out behind her eyes. Trust this stranger or stay here and watch her mother die. She nodded once, decision made. Jack managed to get Sarah across his saddle, securing her as best he could with rope. She was slight, but dead weight always felt heavier than it looked. Emma stood watching, that broken branch still clutched in her small fist like she could not quite bring herself to let go of her only weapon. "Can you ride?" Jack asked. "Papa was teaching me." "Good enough." He lifted her onto the mare behind the saddle. "Hold on to my belt. Do not let go for anything." The ride back to the ranch was the longest 5 miles of Jack's life. The sun climbed higher, turning the air into something that shimmered and burned. Sarah's breathing grew more labored with each passing minute. Emma's small hands gripped his belt so tight he could feel her knuckles digging into his back. Jack had been alone for 8 years. 8 years of silence and solitude, of watching sunsets by himself and eating meals at an empty table. 8 years of convincing himself that was exactly what he wanted. Now, with a dying woman across his saddle and a traumatized child clinging to him like he was the only solid thing in a world that had fallen apart, Jack Mercer felt something stir in his chest. Something he had thought long dead. When the ranch house finally came into view, a low structure of weathered wood with a barn and corral behind it, Jack allowed himself one small breath of relief. They had made it this far. Whether that would be enough, only time would tell. The interior of the ranch house was dim and blessedly cooler than the furnace outside. Jack carried Sarah through the door. Emma following so close she was practically stepping on his heels. He laid Sarah on his own bed, the only real bed in the place, and immediately went to work. Emma stood frozen in the doorway, watching as Jack stripped away the makeshift bandages on her mother's shoulder. The wound beneath was angry and red, radiating heat. Infection had set in deep. He could smell it, that sickly sweet odor of flesh going bad. "Emma, I need you to help me," Jack said without looking up. "Can you do that? What do you need? There is a well outside. I need cold water, as much as you can carry." He pointed to a row of buckets near the door. "Fill those. Bring them here." The girl moved immediately, grateful perhaps to have a task. Jack worked methodically, cleaning the wound with whiskey that made Sarah's unconscious body jerk despite her state. He packed it with a poultice of yarrow and comfrey that he kept for his horses. It worked on people just as well. By the time Emma returned with the first bucket, he was wrapping fresh bandages. "Good," he said. "Set it there. Now go get another." They worked in tandem as the afternoon bled into evening. Jack sponged Sarah's burning skin with cold water, trying to bring her fever down. Emma fetched and carried without complaint, her face set in grim determination. Neither of them spoke beyond what was necessary. As the sun finally began its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Sarah's fever broke. The tension drained from Jack's shoulders when he felt her skin cool beneath his hand. She was not out of danger, but she had cleared the first hurdle. Emma sat slumped against the wall, her eyes half closed. Jack realized the child had not eaten or had water herself in hours, maybe longer. "When did you last eat?" he asked. Emma blinked slowly. "I do not remember." Jack moved to the kitchen, little more than a corner of the main room with a cast-iron stove and a few rough shelves. He built up the fire and set coffee to boil, then pulled out the remains of yesterday's cornbread and some dried venison. Simple fare. But it was what he had. He brought it to Emma on a tin plate. "Eat." She took the plate but did not move to touch the food. Her eyes stayed fixed on her mother. "Is Mama going to die?" The question hung in the air between them. Jack could have lied, could have offered easy comfort. But something about the way Emma looked at him, those two old eyes in that small face, told him she deserved the truth. "I do not know," he said. "She is fighting. That is all we can ask for right now." Emma nodded slowly, accepting this. Then she picked up a piece of cornbread and began to eat mechanically, chewing and swallowing without seeming to taste anything. Jack poured himself coffee and sat in the chair by the bed, watching Sarah's chest rise and fall. The rhythm was steadier now, more regular. A good sign. "Why did you help us?" Jack turned to look at Emma. "What kind of question is that?" "Mama said most people do not help unless there is something in it for them." Emma's voice was matter-of-fact, like she was stating simple arithmetic. "What is in it for you?" "Nothing." Jack took a sip of coffee, bitter and black. "Sometimes people help because it is the right thing to do. Papa used to say that." Emma's lower lip trembled. "He said there were still good people in the world, even when Mama said there was not. Your Mama had reason to be cautious. Sounds like she did not want to come west. She wanted to stay in St. Louis. But Papa said there was opportunity out here. Land. A future." Emma set down the plate, most of the food untouched. "There is no future anymore." Jack wanted to tell her she was wrong, that there was always a future, that things would get better. But the words stuck in his throat, tasting too much like lies. "Get some rest," he said instead. "You can sleep in the loft. There are blankets up there. I want to stay with Mama. She needs quiet. And you need sleep." Emma's jaw set in a stubborn line. "I am not leaving her." Jack recognized when a battle was not worth fighting. "Fine, but you sleep. I will watch her." Emma curled up on the floor beside the bed, using her canvas bag as a pillow. Within minutes, her breathing evened out into the deep rhythm of exhausted sleep. Jack sat in the gathering darkness, listening to the night sounds filtering through the windows. Crickets, the distant call of an owl, the whisper of wind through dry grass. Sounds he had grown used to over 8 years of solitude. sounds that had become the only company he needed. But tonight, with two strangers sleeping under his roof, the silence felt different. Fuller somehow, like the house itself was waking up from a long sleep. Somewhere around midnight, Sarah's eyes opened. She stared at the ceiling for a long moment, confusion clouding her features. Then her head turned, taking in the unfamiliar room, and panic flared across her face. Emma. She tried to sit up, her voice hoarse and desperate. Where is she? She is here. Jack moved into her line of sight, keeping his voice low. Right beside the bed. She is safe. You are both safe. Sarah's gaze found her daughter, and something in her expression crumpled. How? Where? My ranch. I found you on the plains. You have been unconscious for about 12 hours. She tried again to rise, and this time Jack helped her, propping her up with pillows. Her face was pale except for two fever-bright spots on her cheeks. She moved with the careful stiffness of someone in serious pain. The men, she said. Did they? Gone. Long gone, from what Emma told me. Sarah closed her eyes. Thomas, my husband, they killed him. I know. I am sorry. They wanted money. We did not have any. Her voice was hollow. Thomas tried to fight them. They shot him. Then they went through our things. When they did not find what they wanted, they... She touched her shoulder gingerly. One of them cut me. Said it was to teach me not to waste their time. Rage, cold and sharp, settled in Jack's gut. He knew men like that, had killed men like that back in another life. The kind who hurt people for sport, the kind who took pleasure in fear. How many, he asked. 3, maybe 4. I was trying to shield Emma. I could not see everything, her breath hitched. I could not stop them from taking everything. You stopped them from taking what mattered. Jack kept his voice even. Your daughter is alive. You are alive, because of you. Sarah looked at him properly for the first time. Her eyes were dark, almost black in the lamplight, and full of a wariness that Jack recognized. She was measuring him, trying to figure out if he was another threat or something else entirely. Why did you help us? She asked. You do not know us. It was the second time that night someone had asked him that question. Jack wondered what kind of world they had been living in, where kindness required explanation. Like I told Emma, he said, it was the right thing to do. Sarah studied his face for a long moment. Then finally, some of the tension drained from her shoulders. Thank you, she said. I do not know how to repay you. I cannot. Her voice broke. Thank you. Jack stood, uncomfortable with gratitude. You need rest, and food when you are able. We will talk more in the morning. He moved toward the door, intending to sleep in the barn like he had been doing since they arrived. But Sarah's voice stopped him. Mr. Mercer. Jack. She hesitated. The men who did this, if they come back, they will not. And if they are fool enough to try, they will regret it. He stepped out into the night, letting the door close softly behind him. The air had cooled and stars filled the sky from horizon to horizon, vast and indifferent. Jack stood on the porch for a long moment, listening to the silence. In all his years alone on this ranch, he had convinced himself he preferred solitude. It was simpler, safer. People complicated things. They brought trouble and pain and expectations he had never learned how to meet. But tonight, standing under the endless Wyoming sky with two strangers sleeping in his house, Jack felt something shift inside him. Something he could not quite name, but recognized as dangerous nonetheless. He had saved their lives today. That was supposed to be the end of it. The next 3 days passed in a rhythm of careful nursing and cautious recovery. Sarah's fever returned twice more, each time less severe than before. Jack treated it with the same methodical attention he gave to everything else, changing bandages and spooning broth into her when she was awake enough to swallow. Emma was a different kind of challenge. The girl would not speak. Not a single word since that first day. She watched Jack with feral distrust, flinching whenever he moved too fast or reached toward her. She ate only when he was not looking, hiding bread in her pockets and under her pillow like she was storing up for a famine. On the second night, Jack woke to the sound of screaming. He found Emma thrashing in the loft, caught in the grip of a nightmare so fierce that she had torn her blanket in half. When he tried to wake her, she swung at him with tiny fists, eyes wide but seeing nothing. It took Sarah, still weak and trembling, to calm her down. Mother and daughter clung to each other in the darkness, and Jack retreated to the doorway, feeling like an intruder in his own home. "She dreams about that day," Sarah whispered later, after Emma had finally fallen back asleep. "Every night, she dreams about watching her father die." Jack had no words for that. What could you say to a mother watching her child break apart piece by piece? On the fourth morning, Sarah was strong enough to sit at the table for breakfast. Jack had made Johnny cakes and fried salt pork. Simple fare, but Sarah ate like it was a feast. "You are a good cook," she said, surprising him. "It is edible. That is about all I aim for. That is more than I managed on the trail." Sarah's smile was tentative. "Everything I made tasted like smoke and desperation." Jack almost smiled. Almost. After breakfast, he went about his morning chores while Sarah rested, and Emma sat in the corner, watching. Always watching. The girl had not spoken a word in 4 days, but her eyes followed Jack everywhere he went. He was mucking out the horse stall when movement at the barn door made him turn. Emma stood there, small and silent, clutching that same canvas bag she had been carrying since he found her. Jack set down his pitchfork. "Need something?" Emma shook her head. Then, after a long moment of consideration, she walked over to where the barn cats had made their home in a pile of hay. The mother cat had a litter of kittens, maybe 3 weeks old, all tumbling over each other in a fuzzy heap. Emma knelt down and reached out one careful hand. The mother cat sniffed her fingers, then allowed the touch. One of the kittens, a gray and white ball of fluff, wobbled over and climbed into Emma's lap. She looked up at Jack with something like wonder in her eyes. And then, for the first time since he had found her, she spoke. "Kitty," one word, just one word. But it cracked something open in Jack's chest that he had thought sealed shut forever. "That is right," he said, his voice rough. "That is a kitty." Emma turned back to the kitten, stroking its tiny head with a gentleness that made Jack's throat tight. She did not speak again that day, but it did not matter. She had started. That evening, Sarah felt well enough to help with supper. They worked in silence at first, the only sounds the sizzle of meat in the pan and the crackle of the fire. But Jack could feel her watching him, trying to piece together who he was. "You live here alone," she said finally. It was not quite a question. "Have for 8 years. Why?" Jack's hands stilled on the pot he was stirring. "Because I wanted to. That is not an answer. It is the only one I have got." Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Emma likes you." Jack looked up, surprised. "She does not even talk to me. She does not talk to anyone. But she watches you. She follows you around. This morning, when you went to the barn, she went after you." Sarah's eyes were soft. "She has not shown interest in anything since Thomas died, until you." Jack did not know what to do with that information, so he changed the subject. "Your shoulder is healing well. Another week, maybe 2. You should be able to travel." "Travel where?" The question hung between them. Sarah's jaw tightened. "Back east, I suppose. Thomas had a brother in Ohio. If I can get word to him. You got money for passage?" The silence that followed was answer enough. "The men took everything," Sarah said finally. "Every cent we had. Then you cannot leave." Jack's voice came out harsher than he intended. "Not until you have got the means to. I cannot impose on you forever." "You are not imposing." "Jack." Sarah set down the wooden spoon she had been holding. "You have been more than kind, more than generous. But Emma and I need to figure out what comes next, where we go from here. Jack turned to face her fully. You go nowhere until you are healed, until Emma stops flinching at shadows, until you have got a plan that does not end with you and that little girl starving on the side of some road. Sarah's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger, might have been gratitude. It was hard to tell. Why do you care? She asked. You do not know us. We are strangers who showed up on your doorstep half dead. Why does it matter to you what happens to us? Jack was quiet for a long moment, searching for an answer that made sense even to himself. I have been alone a long time, he said finally. Built this ranch from nothing. Worked it by myself. Chose that life. Chose the quiet. He met her eyes. But choosing to be alone is different from standing by when people need help. I might prefer solitude, but I am not heartless. Sarah studied his face. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her because she nodded slowly. All right, she said. We will stay. For now. For now. They finished cooking supper in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. More comfortable. Like something had shifted between them. Some unspoken agreement reached. Later that night, after Emma had fallen asleep in the loft, Sarah sat in the rocking chair by the cold fireplace while Jack cleaned his rifle at the table. The lamplight cast shadows across her face, highlighting the hollows under her eyes and the sharp line of her cheekbones. Can I ask you something? She said. You can ask. Does not mean I will answer. Fair enough. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Emma said something when she was feverish. When we first got here, she said you told her about your daughter. Jack's hands went still on the rifle. She must have been dreaming, Sarah continued, mixing things up. You do not have a daughter. The silence stretched so long that Sarah started to apologize for prying, but Jack's voice stopped her. I did, he said. Her name was Lily. She died 8 years ago, her and her mother both. Fever took them within a week of each other. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. Jack, I am so sorry. I did not know. No reason you would. Jack resumed cleaning the rifle, his movements careful and precise. It was a long time ago. That does not make it hurt less. No. Jack looked up and something raw flickered in his eyes before he shuttered it away. No, it does not. They sat in silence for a while. The only sound, the soft rasp of cloth against metal. Is that why you live alone? Sarah asked finally. Because of them? Partly. Jack set down the rifle. After they died, I was not fit company for anyone. Did some things I am not proud of. Hurt people I should not have hurt. Figured it was better for everyone if I just disappeared. Sarah leaned forward. What kind of things? Jack's jaw tightened. The kind that make a man afraid of himself. Before Sarah could respond, a sound from the loft made them both look up. Emma was crying in her sleep, soft whimpers that cut through the quiet of the house like knife blades. Sarah rose immediately, but Jack held up a hand. Let me try, he said, please. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. Jack climbed the ladder to the loft, moving slowly so Emma would hear him coming. The girl was tangled in her blankets, tears streaming down her face, trapped in whatever nightmare had her in its grip. Easy now. Jack knelt beside her, keeping his voice low and steady. You are safe. You are in my house. No one is going to hurt you. Emma's eyes flew open, wild with fear. For a moment, she did not seem to know where she was. Then her gaze focused on Jack's face and something in her relaxed. Papa, she whispered. Jack's heart stopped. Then Emma blinked, and the words seemed to register. Her face crumpled. I thought you were... I know. Jack reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. But she did not. His hand settled gently on her hair. I know. It is all right. Emma stared at him for a long moment. Then she threw her arms around his neck and sobbed into his shoulder, her small body shaking with grief she had been holding inside for weeks. Jack held her. He did not know what else to do. He just held her and let her cry, and felt something crack open inside his chest that he had thought would never heal. When Sarah climbed up to check on them, she found Emma asleep in Jack's arms, her face finally peaceful. She looked at Jack with something in her eyes that he could not quite read. "Thank you," she whispered. Jack just nodded, not trusting his voice. Something was changing in this house. Something was changing in him. And for the first time in 8 years, Jack Mercer was not sure if that terrified him or gave him hope. 3 weeks passed. A tentative family formed in that small ranch house, built on shared meals and quiet evenings, and the slow, careful work of learning to trust. Emma started speaking again, first in single words, then in halting sentences. She still had nightmares, still flinched at loud noises, still hoarded food under her pillow when she thought no one was looking. But the fierce terror in her eyes was fading, replaced by something softer, something like hope. Jack taught her to read from an old McGuffey's reader that had belonged to his sister. Emma was bright, hungry for knowledge, her small finger tracing the letters with intense concentration. She demanded explanations for everything: why the sky was blue, why horses needed shoes, why the K in knife was silent. That last one, Jack had no answer for. "It is stupid," Emma declared. "Mind your tongue," Sarah said sharply. "But it is stupid," Emma insisted. Jack bit back a smile. "Cannot argue with that, but stupid or not, it is what we have got." Sarah took over household management with quiet efficiency. The bachelor dwelling that had been nothing but 4 walls and a roof for 8 years started to feel like something else. Curtains appeared in the windows. Dried herbs hung in bunches by the door. The smell of baking bread replaced the musty emptiness that had settled into the corners. The house that had been silent for so long now had laughter in it. One morning, Jack slipped away before dawn. Sarah and Emma were still sleeping, and he needed to visit a place he had been avoiding for months. Behind the barn, under a gnarled cottonwood tree, 2 wooden crosses stood side by side. The names carved into them had weathered over 8 years, but Jack knew them by heart. Anne Mercer, beloved wife; Lily Mercer, precious daughter. Jack knelt in the dirt, pulling weeds that had grown up around the graves. He had not come here since spring. It hurt too much. And what was the point of talking to people who could not answer? But today the words came. "Anne," he said, his voice rough. "Something is happening. There is a woman and a little girl living in our house. In your house. They needed help. And I—" He trailed off, struggling. "I'm feeling something again. It scares the hell out of me." The wind picked up, rustling the cottonwood leaves overhead. Jack closed his eyes. "Lily, you would like Emma. She is tough. Pretend she is not scared, just like you used to. She asked me yesterday why the horses do not wear hats if the sun is so hot." A sound escaped him that might have been a laugh or a sob. He was not sure which. "I do not know what I am doing. I do not know if this is right. But for the first time in 8 years, I do not want to be alone anymore. And I do not know what to do with that." He stayed there until the sun cleared the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. When he finally stood, his knees ached, and his eyes were dry and burning. He turned to head back to the house and stopped cold. Sarah stood at the edge of the barn, watching him. She had clearly been there for a while, long enough to hear everything. Jack's jaw tightened. "How long have you been standing there?" "Long enough." Sarah walked toward him, her movements careful. "I did not mean to intrude. I woke up and you were gone. I was worried. Nothing to worry about. I can see that now." She stopped a few feet away, her eyes moving from Jack to the graves and back. "Anne and Lily?" Jack nodded once, not trusting his voice. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I understand now why you keep everyone at a distance. Why you built this life alone." "Do you?" "Yes. Because you love them. and losing them broke something inside you, and you are terrified of letting anyone get close enough to break you again." Jack stared at her. No one had ever seen him so clearly. No one had ever put into words the thing he had been running from for 8 years. "It is easier to be alone," he said finally. "Easier to not care." "Easier," Sarah agreed. "But is it better?" Jack did not have an answer for that. They walked back to the house together, not speaking. Emma was awake, sitting at the table with one of the barn kittens in her lap. "Mama," she called, "can I keep her?" "We are guests here, Emma. You need to ask Mr. Mercer." Emma turned those big blue eyes on Jack. "Please? I will take care of her. I promise." Jack looked at the kitten, then at Emma, then at Sarah. 3 weeks ago, he had been alone. Now there were 3 females in his house, one of them covered in gray fur. "Fine," he said, "but she stays in the barn at night." Emma's face lit up like sunrise. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." She jumped up and threw her arms around his legs. Jack stood frozen, unsure how to respond. His eyes met Sarah's over Emma's head. Sarah was smiling, a real smile, the first one he had seen from her. It transformed her face, softening the hard edges that grief had carved there. Something twisted in Jack's chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. That afternoon, Jack rode into town for supplies. He needed flour and coffee and nails for a fence repair, but mostly he needed space to think. The house that had been his sanctuary for 8 years was starting to feel crowded in ways that had nothing to do with physical space. Bitter Creek was not much of a town. A main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, and a handful of other buildings serving the scattered ranches and homesteads in the territory. Jack conducted his business quickly, avoiding conversation where he could, but the storekeeper's wife, Mrs. Henderson, was impossible to avoid. "Jack Mercer," she said, her eyes bright with curiosity. "I heard you have company out at the ranch. News travels fast. In a town this size, news is all we have." Mrs. Henderson leaned across the counter. "A widow woman and her little girl, is what I heard. You playing Good Samaritan? Something like that." "Well?" Mrs. Henderson smiled knowingly. "It is about time you had some company out there. Man should not be alone forever." Jack paid for his supplies without responding and escaped before she could ask more questions. But her words stuck with him on the ride back to the ranch. A man should not be alone forever. He had told himself for 8 years that alone was what he wanted, what he needed. That the emptiness inside him was a choice, not a sentence. But riding up to his house now, seeing the smoke rising from the chimney and the curtains in the windows, hearing Emma's laughter carrying across the yard, Jack wondered if he had been lying to himself all along. He found Sarah on the porch, shelling peas into a bowl. She looked up when he dismounted. "You were gone a long time. Town was busy." "Was it?" Sarah's eyes were knowing. "Or did you just need time to think?" Jack did not answer. He carried his supplies inside and put them away, trying to ignore the way Sarah's presence seemed to fill every corner of his house. After supper, Emma demanded a story. She had found a book of fairy tales on one of Jack's shelves, probably left behind by his sister years ago, and she would not rest until someone read to her. Sarah started to volunteer, but Emma shook her head. "I want Jack to read it." Jack looked at Sarah helplessly. She just smiled and handed him the book. So Jack Mercer, who had not read a bedtime story to anyone in 8 years, found himself sitting by lamplight with a 5-year-old on his lap, stumbling through the tale of Cinderella while Emma corrected his pronunciation of the French words. When she finally fell asleep, Sarah helped him carry her up to the loft. They stood there for a moment, watching her breathe. This child who had witnessed horrors no child should know and still found it in her to laugh at a kitten and demand fairy tales. "She is remarkable," Sarah whispered. "After everything, she still believes in happy endings. Kids are resilient." "Some kids." Sarah turned to face him, and in the lamplight her eyes looked impossibly dark. "Some kids just break." She did not break. "No." Sarah's voice was soft. "Because you gave her something to hold on to." Jack looked away, uncomfortable. "I did not do anything special." You did. You do. Every day. She reached out and touched his arm just briefly. Thank you, Jack, for everything. She climbed down from the loft, leaving Jack standing there with his heart pounding and his thoughts in chaos. He was in trouble. Deep, dangerous trouble. Because somewhere in the past 3 weeks, Sarah and Emma had stopped being strangers he was helping. They had started becoming something else. Something that terrified him. Something that felt a lot like family. Jack rode to town the next week for supplies, leaving Sarah and Emma alone for the first time since they had arrived. Sarah insisted she was fine. The wound was healed. She could handle the house. Jack should stop hovering. He was not hovering. He was just being careful. But Sarah's jaw had that stubborn set to it, and Jack had learned that arguing with her was like arguing with a fence post, pointless and exhausting. I will be back before dark, he said, mounting his buckskin mare. We will be fine. Sarah stood on the porch, one hand shading her eyes against the morning sun. Go. Jack rode. He was about 2 miles from town when the feeling hit him. That prickle at the back of his neck that had saved his life more times than he could count. The instinct that said something was wrong. He reined in his horse, scanning the horizon. Nothing. Just empty plains stretching in every direction. But the feeling would not go away. Jack turned his horse around and rode hard for the ranch. He heard the screaming before he saw the house. 3 horses were tied outside. 3 men he did not recognize were on his property. One of them was holding Emma, her small body thrashing as she tried to break free. Another was inside the house. And the third, the leader, had Sarah by the hair, a knife pressed to her throat. Jack saw red. He did not remember dismounting. Did not remember drawing his rifle. Did not remember anything except the cold, killing rage that flooded through him like ice water. The first outlaw died before he even knew Jack was there, shot through the throat, dead before he hit the ground. The second one came running out of the house, gun drawn. Jack put a bullet through his chest and kept moving. Brennan, the leader, pressed the knife harder against Sarah's throat. Stop right there or I cut her open. Jack stopped. But he did not lower his rifle. Let them go. Brennan laughed. It was an ugly sound, wet and cruel. You think you're calling the shots here, friend? I got your woman. I got your kid. You do not got nothing but that rifle and a whole lot of stupid. Emma was sobbing, still struggling against the dead man's grip. The body had fallen, but his arm was tangled in her dress. Sarah was deathly pale, blood trickling from where the knife had already nicked her skin. Jack's finger tightened on the trigger. Your mother sent you, Sarah said suddenly. Her voice was steady despite the blade at her throat. Did not she, Brennan? The outlaw's eyes narrowed. How do you know my name? You work for Victoria Caldwell. You killed my husband. Sarah's voice turned to steel. Tell your mother she can go straight to hell. Brennan's lips curled in a sneer. She said you would be difficult. Said you were always the stubborn one. In the split second that Brennan's attention was on Sarah, Jack saw his opening. The knife had shifted just slightly, exposing Brennan's shoulder. Jack fired. The bullet took Brennan in the eye. He dropped like a puppet with cut strings, dead before he knew what hit him. Sarah stumbled free, clutching her bleeding neck. Jack was already moving, pulling Emma from under the dead man's arm, gathering both of them against his chest. It is over. His voice was rough. It is over. You are safe. But his hands were shaking. And when he looked down at Brennan's body, at the blood pooling in the dust, something dark and satisfied stirred in his chest. Not dead enough. The thought came unbidden, and it terrified him. That night, after the bodies had been buried and Emma had finally cried herself to sleep, Sarah found Jack sitting on the porch in the darkness. You need to tell me what happened, she said. You saw what happened. No. Sarah sat down beside him. I saw you kill 3 men in under 10 seconds. I saw the look in your eyes when you did it. That was not just protection, Jack. That was something else. Jack was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, he began to talk. After Anne and Lily died, I went to a dark place. Spent 6 months in the bottom of a whiskey bottle. One night I was in a saloon in Cheyenne. Some drunk said something about my dead daughter, something cruel. His hands clenched. I beat him so bad they did not think he would walk again. Broke his jaw, his ribs, his arm. Would have killed him if someone had not pulled me off. Sarah said nothing. That is when I came out here. Bought this ranch. Disappeared. Because I realized something that night. He finally looked at her. There is something inside me, Sarah. Something dark. Something that likes hurting people who deserve it. And when I saw Brennan with that knife at your throat, he trailed off. You scared yourself, Sarah said softly. Yes. Does that darkness control you? Jack thought about the question. I do not know. I thought I had buried it. But today you saved our lives. Sarah reached out and took his hand, the same hand that had killed 3 men hours ago. I do not care what darkness lives inside you, Jack. I care that you used it to protect my daughter. That matters more than anything else. You should be afraid of me. Maybe. Sarah's grip tightened on his hand. But I am not. I have seen real monsters, Jack. Men who hurt for pleasure. Men who kill for sport. You are not one of them. How do you know? Because you are sitting here in the dark, torturing yourself over what you did. Sarah moved closer, her shoulder pressing against his. Monsters do not feel guilt. You do. That is the difference. Jack did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing, just sat there in the darkness with Sarah's hand in his, feeling the cold knot in his chest slowly begin to loosen. They stayed like that until the stars faded and the eastern sky began to lighten. Not speaking, just being. And somewhere in the silence, something shifted between them. Some wall came down. Some bridge was built. Jack did not have a name for it yet, but he knew with bone-deep certainty that things would never be the same. A week after the attack, Chester Whitmore arrived. Jack was in the barn when he heard the horse, a single rider, well-dressed, on a fine sorrel that looked too clean for trail work. The man dismounted near the porch, dusting off his suit jacket with careful precision. He was perhaps 50, with silver threading through dark hair, and the kind of soft hands that had never held anything heavier than a pen. A leather satchel hung across his chest, and his boots shone despite the dust. Jack stepped out of the barn, rifle casually held in the crook of his arm. "Help you with something?" The man turned, and his smile was all politeness with nothing warm behind it. "Good morning. I am looking for Jack Mercer. Would that be you?" "Depends on who is asking." "My name is Chester Whitmore. I am an attorney from Cheyenne. I represent the Caldwell family of Boston." Jack's grip tightened on the rifle. "Do not know any Caldwells. Perhaps not by name." Whitmore's eyes drifted past Jack toward the house. "But I have reason to believe you may have encountered a woman and child traveling west." "Sarah and Emma Wright? What is your interest in them?" "I am afraid that is confidential client business." Whitmore's smile never wavered. "But I can assure you the Caldwell family has only the child's best interests at heart. Emma is, you see, their granddaughter." The door to the house opened. Sarah stepped onto the porch. The color drained from her face as she took in the scene. "Chester Whitmore," she said, and her voice carried the weight of old fear. "I should have known my mother would send you." Whitmore's smile widened. "Sarah, how delightful to see you looking so well, considering your recent ordeal. What do you want?" "I think you know." He pulled a folded paper from his satchel. "This is a court order granting temporary custody to the Caldwell family pending a full hearing. Your mother is prepared to provide Emma with everything she needs. All you have to do is be reasonable." "Reasonable?" Sarah's laugh was bitter. "That is what she called it when she tried to force me to marry the man she chose. When she cut me off for choosing Thomas, when she told me I was dead to her." She descended the porch steps. "I will not let you take my daughter. I am afraid it is not your choice to make." Whitmore's tone remained pleasant. "The law is quite clear. A mother in your circumstances, no income, no prospects, no permanent residence, is in no position to care for a child. The court will side with the Caldwells. Emma appeared in the doorway, her face pinched with fear. Mama, go back inside, sweetheart. But now, Emma. The girl retreated, but Jack could see her shadow through the window watching. Whitmore cleared his throat. There is no need for this to become unpleasant. The Caldwells are prepared to be generous. They will cover all your medical expenses, provide you with a settlement, allow supervised visits once you have stabilized your situation. How generous, Sarah said coldly. They will pay me to give up my child. They are offering you a fresh start. Without the burden of a child, you could rebuild your life, find employment, perhaps remarry eventually. Emma is not a burden. Of course not. Whitmore's patience was wearing thin. But sentiment aside, you must consider what is best for the child. I know what my mother can provide. Sarah's voice shook with barely contained rage. I grew up in that house. I know exactly what kind of life Emma would have. She would be dressed in expensive clothes and taught to sit still and speak only when spoken to. She would learn which fork to use and how to curtsy, and that her worth is measured by her marriage prospects. Her voice broke. She would learn that love is conditional, that family is about appearances, not affection. I will not do that to her. Jack stepped forward, positioning himself between Whitmore and Sarah. Seems to me the lady has made her position clear. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. And who exactly are you, Mr. Mercer? What is your relationship to Mrs. Wright? I am the man whose property you are standing on. Ah, yes, the Good Samaritan. Whitmore's lip curled. Tell me, what does a man like you expect in return for his charity? A woman alone, grateful, perhaps pliable. Jack's jaw tightened. Watch your mouth. I am simply pointing out that your motives may be questioned. A single woman residing with an unmarried man. No chaperone. It does not look good, does it? One might wonder about the propriety of the situation. How dare you, Sarah said. I dare because I'm thinking of the child. Whitmore slipped the court order back into his satchel. You have 1 week to respond to the petition, Mrs. Wright. If you contest it, there will be a hearing in Cheyenne. I strongly suggest you consider the inevitable outcome before you put yourself and your daughter through that ordeal. He mounted his horse. Good day to you both. They watched him ride away, dust rising in his wake. Sarah stood rigid, her arms wrapped around herself. Sarah, Jack started. Do not. She held up a hand. Just do not. She walked back into the house. That night, Jack rode to town. The telegraph office was still open, and Albert behind the counter looked up with surprise. Jack Mercer. Do not usually see you in town at this hour. Need to send a telegram. Jack pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. On it was the name of a lawyer in Cheyenne who owed him a favor from years past. A good lawyer. An honest one. Albert copied down the message and promised to send it within the hour. Jack's next stop was the land office, where he spent 30 minutes reviewing property records. Then the general store, where he listened to the gossip flowing around him. By the time he rode back to the ranch, the sky was full of stars. Sarah was waiting on the porch. Emma was asleep inside. Where did you go? Had business in town. Jack dismounted and tied his horse. I talked to a lawyer. Name is Porter. Good man. Honest. He owes me. Sarah stared at him. Jack. He says we might have a chance. The Caldwells are making their case sound stronger than it is. They have been estranged from you for years. They showed no interest in Emma until now. And they are basically arguing that money is more important than a mother's love. He handed her the telegram he had received before leaving town. Porter says judges do not like rich people trying to buy children, even when it is dressed up as concern. Sarah read the telegram. Her hands were shaking. He thinks I might have a chance. He thinks we might have a chance. Jack met her eyes. If you will let me help. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. Then she said the words that changed everything. There is something I need to tell you. Something about my family. About why my mother really wants Emma. Jack listened as Sarah revealed the secret she had been carrying. Her father had died 3 months ago. He had left a trust fund for Emma, $200,000. Victoria Caldwell was not trying to save her granddaughter. She was trying to control a fortune. You knew, Jack said slowly. All this time, you knew there was money involved. I did not want his money. I never wanted anything from them. Thomas never knew. I was ashamed. Your mother sent those men, Sarah. She had your husband killed. And you did not think I needed to know why. The words came out harsher than he intended. Sarah flinched like he had struck her. I was afraid. Afraid that if you knew about the money, you would think that I only helped you for the inheritance? Jack's voice was flat. Is that what you think of me? No. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I think you are the most decent man I have ever met. I think you saved our lives without asking for anything in return. I think... She stopped, struggling. I think I have made such a mess of everything. Silence stretched between them. Jack felt the anger burning in his chest, but underneath it was something else. Something that looked a lot like fear. He had started to care about this woman, about her daughter, about the life they were building together in this house. And she had been keeping secrets. Porter sent another telegram, he said finally. Says there is one thing that would strengthen our case considerably. What? Marriage. Court favors intact families. Sarah stared at him. Jack, I am not asking you to love me. I am asking you to let me stand beside you. Let me be the wall between Emma and whatever your mother tries to do. Let me give you both the protection of my name and this ranch. You are still angry at me. Furious, Jack agreed, but that does not change what needs to happen. Why would you do this after I lied to you? Because Emma called me Papa yesterday. Because this house is not empty anymore. Because... He stopped, then forced himself to continue. Because I would rather be angry with you in it than peaceful without you. Sarah was silent for a long moment. Then she said, That is the least romantic proposal I have ever heard. I never claimed to be romantic. No. A ghost of a smile crossed her face. You claim to be honest. I am trying. Sarah looked at the telegram in her hand, then at Jack, then at the house where her daughter was sleeping. All right, she said. Partners? Partners. They did not touch, did not embrace. Just stood there in the darkness, two broken people agreeing to face the storm together. It was not love, but it was the beginning of something. The wedding took place 3 days later in the Bitter Creek Church. Reverend Collins officiated. His wife, Martha, served as witness. Emma held a bouquet of wildflowers she had picked that morning. Jack wore the black suit he had not touched in 8 years. It smelled of cedar and memories. Sarah wore the only good dress she had, pale blue with small flowers embroidered at the collar. When Reverend Collins asked if Jack would take Sarah as his wife, Jack said yes without hesitation. When he asked Sarah the same, she paused, just for a moment. Her eyes found Jack's across the small space between them. I will, she said. The kiss was brief, formal, a contract sealed. But when Jack pulled back, something flickered in Sarah's eyes that had not been there before. Outside the church, Chester Whitmore was waiting. A marriage of convenience, he said smoothly. How touching. Convenient or not, Jack said, she is my wife now. Emma is my legal daughter. You want her? You go through me. Whitmore smiled thinly. The hearing is scheduled for 2 weeks from today. I trust you will both be in attendance. He mounted his horse and rode away. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Porter arrived from Cheyenne, a sharp-eyed man in his 30s who attacked the Caldwell's case like a terrier with a rat. Their case is built on implications and insinuations, he told Jack and Sarah. They are claiming you are an unfit mother, that your living situation is improper, that the violence on your property makes this an unsafe environment for a child. 3 men tried to kidnap my daughter, Sarah said hotly. Jack protected us. I know, and we will make sure the judge knows the full story, but Whitmore is good at what he does. He will try to paint Jack as unstable, violent. He will try to make the marriage look like a sham. Let him try, Jack said. Porter looked at him steadily. Can you keep your composure on the stand, no matter what he says, no matter how he tries to provoke you? I can handle it. Can you? Because if you lose your temper, if you give him anything to work with, we lose everything. Jack thought about the rage that lived inside him, the darkness he had spent 8 years trying to bury. I will handle it, he said again. 2 nights before the hearing, Jack woke to Sarah's scream. He found her standing in Emma's room. The bed was empty, the window was open, and on the pillow was a note in elegant handwriting. I told you, I always get what I want. Withdraw the custody challenge, or you will never see her again. She is safe, for now. Mother. Sarah's knees buckled. Jack caught her before she hit the floor. She took her. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. My mother took my daughter. Jack's blood turned to ice. Then it turned to fire. Get dressed, he said. We are riding to Cheyenne, now. The ride took most of the night. They pushed the horses hard, stopping only when absolutely necessary. Sarah did not speak, did not cry, just stared ahead with a look in her eyes that Jack recognized. It was the look of a woman preparing to kill. Porter met them at dawn with news. Victoria was keeping Emma at the Grand Hotel, guarded by hired men. How many guards? Jack asked. At least 4, maybe more. I need to get inside. Sarah's voice was deadly calm. I need to get my daughter. It is too dangerous. Porter shook his head. We should go to the marshal. The marshal will take days. Jack cut him off. We do not have days. What are you suggesting? Jack looked at Sarah, then back at Porter. I am suggesting, he said, that I create a distraction while Sarah gets Emma out. That is insane. Probably. But it is also the only way. Sarah stepped forward. It should be me going in. She is my daughter. Jack started to argue, but something in her eyes stopped him. The warrior mother. The woman who had survived an attack that killed her husband. The woman who had kept her daughter alive through sheer force of will. All right, he said, but you let me clear a path first. The Grand Hotel was 3 stories of brick and false elegance. Jack walked through the front door like he owned the place, making as much noise as possible. He demanded to see the manager, complained about non-existent problems with his non-existent room, created exactly the kind of scene that drew every eye in the lobby, including the 2 guards stationed by the stairs. Meanwhile, Sarah slipped in through the service entrance. Porter had drawn her a map. 3rd floor, room 12. 2 guards outside the door. She climbed the back stairs, her heart pounding so hard she could barely hear anything else. In her pocket was a small pistol Jack had given her. She had never fired one before, but she would learn. The hallway on the 3rd floor was empty except for the 2 men standing outside room 12. They looked up when they saw her. Can I help you, ma'am? Sarah did not hesitate. She walked toward them with a tray she had grabbed from a service cart, playing the part of a maid. Room service, she said. One of the guards reached for the tray. We did not order. Sarah smashed it into his face. The 2nd guard went for his gun. Sarah was faster. The pistol came out of her pocket and she fired without thinking. The bullet took him in the chest. He fell. Sarah stared at him for a long moment. The first man she had ever killed. Her hands were shaking violently, but she did not stop. She burst through the door. Emma was there, sitting on the bed, eyes wide with terror. When she saw her mother, she screamed. Mama! Sarah swept her up in her arms. Come with me, baby. We are going home. They made it to the hallway before Victoria appeared. Sarah's mother stood at the end of the corridor, blocking the stairs. She was dressed in black silk, diamonds glittering at her throat. Her face was a mask of cold fury. You always were dramatic, Sarah, just like your father. You had Thomas killed. I had him frightened. He was supposed to run home with his tail between his legs. Victoria's voice was dismissive. He chose to fight instead. Stupid man. Sarah raised the gun. Move aside, Mother. You will not shoot me. Victoria's smile was contemptuous. You do not have it in you. Sarah's hand steadied. 3 minutes ago, I killed a man. I have more in me than you ever knew. Now move. For the first time in her life, Victoria Caldwell backed down. Sarah pushed past her. Emma clutched tight against her chest. They made it down the stairs and out the back entrance where Jack was waiting with horses. Go! He shouted. More guards were coming. Jack fired twice, dropping one, sending the others scrambling for cover. Then he swung up onto his horse and they rode. A bullet caught him in the shoulder. Jack grunted, but did not stop, did not even slow down. They rode through the streets of Cheyenne, through the outskirts, into the open plains beyond. Only when they were miles from town did Sarah realize Jack was bleeding badly. Jack. She reined in her horse. Jack, you are hurt. I'm fine. You are not fine. You have been shot. I have been shot before. Jack's voice was strained. Keep riding. We need to get to Porter's office. The hearing is tomorrow. You need a doctor. I need to make sure you and Emma are safe. Everything else can wait. They rode through the night. By the time they reached Porter's office, Jack was barely conscious. Sarah had to help him off his horse, supporting his weight as they staggered through the door. Porter took one look at them and went pale. What happened? We got Emma back, Sarah said. And we are going to that hearing tomorrow if Jack has to crawl there on his hands and knees. Jack looked up at her through the haze of pain and blood loss. I can walk, he said. Just need a minute. You need a doctor after the hearing. He met her eyes, and beneath the exhaustion and agony, she saw something fierce and determined. We finish this first, then I can rest. Sarah stared at him. This man who had taken a bullet for her daughter, who was bleeding out in a lawyer's office but refused to stop fighting. All right, she said softly, we finish this. She took his hand, the same hand that had killed for them, protected them, saved them, together. The courtroom in Cheyenne was packed. Word had spread about the kidnapping, the rescue, the shooting. Everyone wanted to see how it would end. Jack sat at the defendant's table with his arm in a sling, blood still seeping through his bandages. Sarah was beside him, pale but composed. Emma was with Martha Collins in the front row, clutching her cloth doll. Victoria Caldwell sat on the opposite side of the room, rigid as a statue. Chester Whitmore whispered urgently in her ear. Judge Morrison entered and took his seat. He was a stern-faced man in his 50s with silver hair and wire-rimmed spectacles. His eyes swept the courtroom, taking in the tension. We are here today to consider a petition for custody of the minor child Emma Wright, he said. Mr. Whitmore, you may present your opening statement. Whitmore stood, adjusting his jacket. Your Honor, this is a straightforward case about what is best for the child. Emma Wright is the granddaughter of Edward and Victoria Caldwell, upstanding citizens with the means and desire to provide her with every advantage. Her mother, while no doubt well-intentioned, is a penniless widow who has demonstrated questionable judgment in her recent decisions. He paused. The Caldwells seek custody not out of malice, but out of genuine concern for their granddaughter's welfare. Porter rose. Your Honor, the respondent is no longer a penniless widow, but Mrs. Sarah Mercer, wife of Jack Mercer, a respected rancher and landowner. She has a stable home, a loving family, and most importantly, she is Emma's mother. The Caldwells' sudden interest in their granddaughter comes only after they have been estranged from Mrs. Mercer for years. He looked directly at Victoria. And it is worth examining their true motives. Judge Morrison made a note. Mr. Whitmore, call your first witness. The petitioner calls Mrs. Victoria Caldwell. Victoria took the stand, her back straight, her face composed. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Her testimony was polished, rehearsed. She painted herself as a concerned grandmother who only wanted what was best for her grandchild. She expressed regret about the estrangement with Sarah. She implied that Sarah's judgment had always been poor. When Porter rose for cross-examination, his expression was sharp. "Mrs. Caldwell, you say you love your daughter. Is that why you cut her off completely when she married against your wishes?" "I had to make a difficult choice. A choice that left a 20-year-old woman alone with no family support. And when your daughter was attacked, when her husband was murdered, you did not rush to her aid. You hired a private investigator." "Why?" Victoria's composure flickered. "I wanted to assess the situation. Or perhaps you wanted to locate Emma specifically because there was something you had not mentioned to this court. Your husband's will, filed with probate in Boston 3 months ago. In it, he leaves a substantial trust fund, $200,000, to his only grandchild." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Porter pressed on. "That inheritance is the real reason for this custody petition, is it not? You want control of Emma because you want control of that money. That is absurd. Is it?" Porter turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I would like to submit this will as evidence. The trust specifies that Emma's legal guardian has full authority over the funds until she reaches 21. Judge Morrison studied the document. The will is admitted into evidence. The proceedings continued. Whitmore called character witnesses for Victoria. Porter called Reverend Collins and Martha, who testified to Sarah's devotion to Emma. Then Porter called Sarah to the stand. She told the truth. All of it. About the attack. About the outlaws who killed her husband. About the scarred man who said her mother sent them. Whitmore tried to shake her on cross-examination. "Mrs. Mercer, you describe yourself as a devoted mother. Yet you dragged your daughter into the wilderness against your own mother's advice. You married a man your family disapproved of, and you ended up watching your husband die violently. Is that your definition of good judgment?" Sarah's voice was steady. "Thomas wanted a better life for us. We were chasing that dream, a dream that got him killed, and now you have married another man you barely know. What happens when this marriage no longer serves your purposes?" "I made vows," Sarah said. "I intend to keep them, even though you do not love him?" The question hung in the air. Sarah's eyes found Jack across the courtroom. "I did not say I do not love him," she said quietly. "I said the marriage started as a practical arrangement. That does not mean it will stay that way." Whitmore smiled coldly. "How convenient. You discover love just in time for this hearing." Objection. Porter was on his feet. "Counsel is badgering the witness." Sustained. Finally, Porter called Jack to the stand. Jack walked to the witness box, his injured shoulder throbbing with every step. He placed his hand on the Bible. "Mr. Mercer," Porter began, "you appear to be injured." "Yes, sir. Got shot last night protecting my daughter from kidnappers." The courtroom erupted again. Whitmore objected. Judge Morrison overruled him. Porter laid out the whole story: the kidnapping, the rescue, Victoria's hired guards, the evidence linking her to the original attack that killed Thomas Wright. When it was Whitmore's turn, he tried to paint Jack as violent and unstable. "You killed 3 men on your property, did you not? I killed 3 men who were trying to kidnap a child and murder her mother." Jack's voice was flat. "I would do it again. You have a history of violence. A saloon fight years ago where you nearly killed a man. He said something about my dead daughter." Jack's jaw tightened. "I lost control. I am not proud of it. But I have spent 8 years making sure it never happened again. Until recently. Until someone threatened my family." "Yes," Whitmore smiled thinly. "Your family. A woman you have known for barely 2 months. A child who is not yours by blood. You expect this court to believe you risked your life for strangers?" Jack looked at Sarah, at Emma, at the life he had found when he stopped running from his past. "They are not strangers," he said. "They are mine. And I will protect them with everything I have. That is what family means." The courtroom was silent. Judge Morrison spoke. "I have heard enough testimony. Both sides will submit closing arguments. Porter went first. Your Honor, the evidence is clear. Emma Wright is loved, cared for, and safe with her mother and stepfather. The Caldwells' petition is motivated by greed, not concern. They seek control of the child's inheritance, nothing more. I urge you to deny their petition. Whitmore's closing was polished. Your Honor, whatever the Caldwells' motivations, the facts remain. Mrs. Mercer has shown poor judgment throughout her life. Her current husband is a violent man with a troubled past. The child would be better served in a stable, established household with proper resources and oversight. Judge Morrison removed his spectacles and cleaned them slowly. This is a difficult case, he said. On one hand, we have grandparents with substantial means. On the other, a mother who clearly loves her daughter. He paused. But there is one factor that troubles me greatly: the trust fund. The Caldwells showed no interest in Emma until after the money became available. That suggests their motives are not as pure as they claim. Victoria's face went rigid. However, Judge Morrison continued, I also have concerns about the Mercer marriage. It happened very quickly under unusual circumstances. He looked at Jack and Sarah. I am going to make you an offer. If you renounce Emma's inheritance, if you sign documents ensuring the money reverts to the Caldwell estate, it will prove your motives are pure. And I can rule based solely on what is best for the child. The courtroom held its breath. Sarah did not hesitate. I will sign whatever you need, she said. My daughter is not for sale. Jack nodded. Both of us. Judge Morrison almost smiled. Very well, my clerk will prepare the documents. He turned to Victoria. Mrs. Caldwell, based on the evidence presented regarding the kidnapping and your connection to the attack that killed Thomas Wright, I am ordering you detained pending investigation. You will be remanded to territorial custody until trial. Victoria's face went white. Territorial marshals stepped forward to escort her out. For one moment, her eyes met Sarah's. There was no apology in them, no regret, only cold fury. Sarah watched her mother disappear through the courthouse doors. She felt nothing. And that was exactly right. Judge Morrison banged his gavel. Custody of Emma Wright, now Emma Mercer, is hereby granted to her mother and stepfather. This case is closed. Emma broke free from Martha Collins and ran to Jack and Sarah, throwing her arms around both of them. Can we go home now? Jack looked at Sarah over their daughter's head. Yes, sweetheart, he said. Let us go home. They walked out of the courthouse into Wyoming sunlight. The sky was endless blue, stretching from horizon to horizon. The air smelled of dust and sage and freedom. Emma held both their hands, swinging between them as they walked. Jack's shoulder throbbed, but he barely noticed. Sarah's eyes were bright with tears. She was finally allowing herself to cry. Emma was humming a tune she had learned from Martha Collins. They reached the wagon where their horses were tied. Jack started to help Sarah up, then stopped. Sarah. She turned. He kissed her. Not the brief formal kiss from their wedding. This was real. This was everything that had been building between them since the day he found her on those plains. All the fear and hope and anger and tenderness, all tangled together into something that felt a lot like love. When they pulled apart, Emma was giggling. Does this mean you love each other now? Sarah looked at Jack. He looked back. Getting there, he said. Getting there, she agreed. They climbed into the wagon and headed west. Behind them, the courthouse grew smaller. Ahead, the Wyoming skies stretched endless and blue. The ride home took most of the day. They stopped once to water the horses and eat the food Martha Collins had packed for them. Emma fell asleep against Sarah's side, exhausted by everything that had happened. Jack drove in silence, his thoughts turning over and over. 2 months ago, he had been alone. 8 years of isolation, of convincing himself he wanted nothing and needed no one. 8 years of visiting graves and talking to ghosts and pretending that was enough. Now he had a wife, a daughter, a family. He had also taken a bullet, killed men, and faced down the most powerful woman in Boston. It had been an eventful 2 months. Sarah's voice broke into his thoughts. What are you thinking about? How much has changed? Good changes? Jack considered the question. I think so. Yeah, good changes. Sarah leaned against his uninjured shoulder. I was so afraid, she said quietly. Not just of my mother. Of everything. Of starting over. Of trusting someone again after Thomas. And now I am still afraid. But I am also hopeful, and that is something I had not felt in a long time. Jack did not know what to say to that, so he just nodded and kept driving. They reached the ranch as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. The house looked small against the vast Wyoming landscape, weathered wood and simple construction. But there was smoke rising from the chimney. Someone had come by and lit the fire for them. Probably Martha Collins, bless her. And there was a lamp burning in the window. Jack reined in the horses but did not move to get down. Sarah looked at him. What is it? The lamp, Jack said. I left it on, Sarah said, before we went to Cheyenne, so we would have light to come home to. Jack stared at that small flame. For 8 years he had come home to darkness, to silence, to nothing. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For leaving a light on. He meant so much more than the lamp, and she knew it. She took his hand. Always, she said. They sat there together, watching their home glow in the darkness, as the Wyoming night settled around them. Inside there was warmth, there was food, there was a future, there was family. And for the first time in 8 years, Jack Mercer was not afraid of any of it. 1 year later. Jack rode across the plains, the same route he had taken that day when everything changed. The August sun beat down with the same relentless heat. The grass was the same shade of gold. But everything else was different. He stopped his horse at the spot where he had found Sarah and Emma. There was no trace of what had happened here. The wagon ruts had long since disappeared. The blood had washed away with winter rains. The grass had grown back, thick and green. From the direction of the ranch, Emma's voice carried across the wind. Papa, supper is ready. Jack smiled. Coming, he called back. He turned his horse toward home. The ranch had grown in the past year. A new barn, an expanded corral, a proper garden that Sarah tended with fierce determination. The house had a fresh coat of whitewash and real glass windows instead of oiled paper. Emma was waiting on the porch, her gray and white cat twined around her ankles. She was 6 now, taller, stronger, her nightmares fading into memory. She still flinched at loud noises sometimes, still hoarded food under her pillow when she thought no one was looking, but she laughed more than she cried, and that was progress. Mama says if you are late one more time, she is giving your supper to the pigs. We do not have pigs. Emma grinned. I know, but she says it anyway. Jack dismounted and ruffled her hair. Then we best not keep her waiting. Inside, the house smelled of bread and roasted meat. Sarah stood at the stove, her back to him, but she turned when she heard his footsteps. Her belly was round with their child. 6 months along, the doctor said. A boy, if the old wives' tales were right. You are late, she said. Ran into trouble at the south fence. Coyote's got another calf, 3rd one this month. I know. Jack crossed to her and kissed her cheek. I will ride out tomorrow, see if I can find the den. Be careful, always. They sat down to supper, the 3 of them around the table that had been empty for so long. Emma chattered about her lessons. She was reading chapter books now, real stories with plot and characters. Sarah talked about the preserves she was putting up, enough to last the winter, and then some. Jack mostly listened. This was what he had been missing all those years, alone. Not just company, but connection. The small moments that added up to a life. After supper, Emma demanded a story. Jack read to her from the book of fairy tales, same as always. She fell asleep before he reached the end, same as always. He carried her up to the loft and tucked her in. The gray cat jumped up and curled at her feet. "Good night, sweetheart. Night, Papa." When he came back down, Sarah was sitting in the rocking chair by the fireplace. The fire was low, just embers now, casting a warm glow across her face. Jack sat down across from her. "You have that look," Sarah said. "What look?" "The one where you are thinking too hard about something." Jack was quiet for a moment. "A year ago today," he said finally. "That is when I found you." "I know." Sarah smiled. "I have been thinking about it all day. I was riding fence, just like today, and then I heard the scream. And you came. I came." Jack looked at his hands. "I almost did not, you know. I almost just kept riding. Figured it was none of my business. But you did not." "No, I did not." Sarah reached out and took his hand. "Why?" Jack thought about the question. He had asked it of himself 1,000 times over the past year. "I think," he said slowly, "I think I was ready to stop being alone. I just did not know it yet. And then there you were, you and Emma. And something in me recognized that this was what I had been waiting for, even though you did not know us, even though I did not know you." Jack squeezed her hand. "I knew enough. I knew a mother was dying trying to protect her child. I knew a little girl was fighting to save her mama. I knew that was worth stopping for." Sarah's eyes were wet. "I am glad you stopped. Me too." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the embers glow. "I got a letter today," Sarah said eventually. "From Boston, from my mother's lawyer." Jack tensed. "What does she want?" "Nothing. She is in the territorial prison now, serving 10 years for conspiracy." Sarah's voice was flat. "The lawyer says she wants to see me, to apologize." "What did you tell him?" "That I have no mother. That she died to me a long time ago." Jack nodded. "You could go," he said, "if you wanted. Hear what she has to say." "I know." Sarah's hand moved to her belly. "But I do not want to. I have everything I need right here." The fire crackled. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance. Jack thought about everything that had brought them to this moment. The violence and the fear. The trust slowly built and broken and rebuilt. The legal battles and the bullets and the long nights wondering if any of it would work out. And now here they were. A family, a home, a future. It had not been easy. Nothing worth having ever was. But it was good. It was right. It was everything Jack had given up hope of ever finding again. "Sarah," he said. "Yes, I love you." The words still felt strange in his mouth. He had not said them to anyone in 8 years, had not let himself feel them. But they were true, completely and utterly true. Sarah smiled. "I love you too." She stood, moving carefully with her pregnant belly, and came to sit beside him. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him. They watched the fire die down together, not speaking, not needing to. Outside, the Wyoming night was vast and dark and full of stars. The same sky that had watched over this land for thousands of years. The same stars that would watch over generations yet to come. Inside this small house, this improbable family, there was warmth, there was love, there was hope. Jack Mercer had spent 8 years running from his past, hiding from his pain, convincing himself that alone was safe and solitude was strength. He had been wrong. Strength was this: opening yourself up to loss, choosing to love even when you knew how much it could hurt, building something new from the wreckage of what came before. Sarah and Emma had taught him that, had dragged him back to life when he did not even know he needed saving. And now, with his wife in his arms and his daughter sleeping in the loft and their child growing beneath Sarah's heart, Jack finally understood what he had found. Not just a family, not just a home, but a second chance. And he would spend the rest of his life making sure he did not waste it. The lamp in the window burned on. a small, bright point against the darkness. A beacon, a promise. There would always be a light on in this house. There would always be someone waiting. There would always be home. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.